Jakes used to come to my parties. T.D. Jakes also gave me young boys from church for sacrifice.
Diddy told me to go into a partnership with him and said he would pay me a good amount of money. He said that this way people would see him as religious. I agreed. Please forgive me.
A recorded phone call between Diddy and Bishop T.D., the revered preacher who's counseled presidents, guided global congregations, and inspired millions with his booming voice of hope. But what played out in that Miami courtroom wasn't a sermon. It was a chilling strategy session that turned faith into a weapon, a calculated dance of power cloaked in scripture. The revelation didn't just shock the room, it sent ripples through the world, threatening to unravel the trust of those who once saw Jakes as a beacon of divine truth. This wasn't just a trial about Diddy's alleged crimes, it was a reckoning for the very idea of faith, and it's about to change everything you thought you knew about power, trust, and betrayal. The Miami courtroom, usually a sterile space of law and order, felt like a pressure cooker as the session began. Spectators packed the gallery, their whispers buzzing like static electricity. Reporters from TMZ, People, and the New York Times scribbled furiously, sensing a story that could dominate headlines for weeks. Diddy sat at the defense table, his signature swagger replaced by a tense stillness, his tailored suit unable to mask the strain in his eyes. Across the room, the prosecution team, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Carla Rivera, moved with precision, their faces betraying nothing but focus. Rivera, a seasoned prosecutor known for dismantling high-profile cases, stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. In her hand, she held a small flash drive, its metallic gleam catching the light like a detonator. "Your Honor," she began, her voice cutting through the murmurs, "the prosecution requests permission to present newly obtained audio evidence, recovered from a secure storage device seized during a federal raid on Mr. Combs's Miami property." The judge, Honorable Marcus Ellison, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What's the source?" he asked, his tone wary. "This specific file is a private phone call between the defendant and Bishop T.D. Jakes, dated August 9, 2022, approximately 6 months before federal investigations began." The courtroom erupted in gasps, a wave of shock rolling from the gallery to the jury box. T.D. Jakes, the man whose sermons filled arenas, whose books topped bestseller lists, whose voice had been a lifeline for millions, was now tied to Diddy in a way no one could have imagined. Judge Ellison's face hardened, but he nodded. "Proceed." The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the room, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The audio began, crackling through the courtroom's speakers, and the voices were unmistakable. Diddy, his tone low and urgent. "Things are heating up, Bishop. I need your covering. They're sniffing around LA, asking questions." Jakes, calm and deliberate, his voice carrying the same cadence that had moved congregations. "You built this with layers, Sean. They won't see the root. Stay aligned. Keep the inner circle closed." The conversation wasn't a casual check-in. It was a chess game, each word chosen with precision. Jakes continued. "What about the others?" Diddy's voice tightened. "Some are shaky. What if they talk?" Jakes' reply was chilling. "If they break, they break. The weak ones always fold. Just make sure the cameras stay buried." The room gasped again, louder this time. A woman in the gallery clutched her chest, her eyes wide with disbelief. A juror, a middle-aged man with a notepad frozen in his hand, shook his head slowly, as if trying to process the weight of what he'd heard. Jennifer Lopez, seated in the back row, her face partially obscured by oversized sunglasses, sat rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line. Lopez, who had once been Diddy's partner in the spotlight, seemed to carry the ghosts of their shared past, her presence a silent reminder of the empire Diddy had built and the shadows it cast. The audio continued, each exchange more damning than the last. Diddy pressed, "What about the press? There's talk. Even J-Lo's team is asking questions again." Jakes' response was smooth, almost rehearsed. "Let them ask. You don't owe them the full truth, just enough to distract, confuse the narrative, feed them an exclusive. Silence is a form of wisdom, my brother." The phrase hit like a thunderclap. Silence as wisdom, not the biblical kind, but a weapon to deflect scrutiny. Jakes went further. "And if the victims speak, then you remind them who they're up against. Not everyone gets to rise. Some disappear. That's balance." The courtroom felt like it had been sucked dry of air. A woman in the gallery stifled a sob, her hand covering her mouth. Another juror, a young woman with braided hair, leaned forward, her eyes narrowing in disgust. The audio ended abruptly and the lights flickered back on, but no one moved. Diddy sat frozen, his face unreadable, his hands clasped tightly on the table. His legal team, led by high-powered attorney Michael Grayson, stared straight ahead, their usual confidence replaced by a tense silence. Rivera stepped forward. her voice steady but laced with indignation. What you just heard is not just evidence of collaboration. It is a chilling conversation between a defendant accused of surveillance, intimidation, and abuse, and a religious figure instructing him on how to maintain power through spiritual manipulation and the suppression of truth. She paused, letting the words sink in. "The weak ones always fold," she repeated, her eyes locking with the jury. That is what he said about the victims, the people who suffered behind closed doors. The courtroom remained still, the weight of Rivera's words settling like a fog. She continued, her tone rising with controlled fury. "This isn't just a scandal. This is betrayal, not only of trust but of faith itself." The judge exhaled deeply, his fingers tapping the bench as if grappling with the enormity of what had unfolded. "We'll adjourn for a short recess," he said quietly, but no one moved immediately. The gallery sat in stunned silence, reporters clutching their notebooks, spectators whispering in disbelief. Jennifer Lopez slipped out quietly, her head bowed, avoiding the swarm of cameras waiting outside. The recess felt less like a break and more like a moment to process the unthinkable. T.D. Jakes, the man who had preached redemption to millions, had been caught advising Diddy on how to bury the truth. The courtroom, once a place of legal procedure, now felt like a sanctuary defiled, its air heavy with the echoes of a voice that had once lifted souls but now seemed to orchestrate silence. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted. The initial shock had given way to a quiet, simmering anger, as if the room itself was mourning the loss of something sacred. Rivera returned to the center, holding a stack of printouts, each page stamped with a federal watermark. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "we would like to present the full transcript of the Diddy T.D. Jake's conversation in written form, to be entered into the record alongside the audio. We also request the court's attention for the next exhibit, an internal memo from Diddy's legal consultant dated August 11, 2022, referencing a spiritual firewall and a divine handler, phrases that appear within 2 days of the call with Bishop Jakes." The judge nodded, his expression weary. "Submit it." The projector hummed to life, and the screen lit up with the first page of the document. Subject, Crisis Protocol, Spiritual Firewall Strategy. Date, August 11th, 2022. From Redacted, Legal Strategist, Combs Enterprises, to Executive Risk Team. The text was clinical, almost corporate. Following this week's counsel with Jay, Combs has been advised to maintain minimal direct response. Messaging will be filtered through spiritual intermediaries and aligned influencers. Jay will help provide theological framing if faith communities raise questions. Keep messaging light, forgiveness, redemption, persecution. The room gasped again, but this time it was less shock and more realization, a dawning understanding that this wasn't a one-off conversation, but part of a broader strategy. Rivera turned to the jury, her voice cutting through the tension. "Let's break this down. Spiritual intermediaries. Theological framing. This memo doesn't refer to damage control. It refers to weaponizing faith, using scripture not to uplift but to deflect, to manipulate." She clicked to the next slide, revealing handwritten notes from a private assistant's notebook, seized during the same Miami raid. One line, scrawled in blue ink, stood out. "Call Jakes. Circle's nervous. Get a word on containment and loyalty. Use scripture." The courtroom fell into stunned silence again. The dots no longer just lines, but a blueprint. Rivera's gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Diddy, who remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the table. "This is no longer about whether T.D. Jake simply knew what was happening," she said. "It's about how involved he was in keeping it hidden." The defense, led by Grayson, stood quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. There's no proof that Bishop Jakes saw or approved this memo." Rivera didn't flinch. "Your Honor, we are not claiming authorship. We are showing influence. The memo references specific phrases used in the leaked call: spiritual firewall, alignment over exposure, divine handling. These are not coincidences. These are tactics discussed between the defendant and a man he called his spiritual architect." The judge overruled the objection, his voice firm, sustained for clarity of influence, not direct authorship. The prosecution's case was building, each piece of evidence a brick in a wall that seemed to close in on Diddy, and, by extension, Jakes. Rivera clicked to another slide, this one a chart titled Sermons versus Scandals, Timeline Crossmatch. The left column listed major headlines tied to Diddy, June 2018. Assault allegations from an NYC party. November 2019, leaked footage of an altercation at Diddy's estate. March 2022, an anonymous whistleblower report submitted to the FBI. The right column listed T.D., Jakes' sermon titles delivered within 1 to 3 days of each incident, covering the called, brotherhood in the fire, the enemy hates alignment. The parallels were undeniable. Rivera's voice grew sharper. These were not random sermons. They were timed, coordinated, designed to frame Diddy's troubles as spiritual persecution, to silence questions with scripture. She paused, letting the jury absorb the chart. This wasn't spiritual encouragement. This was narrative control, emotional conditioning, messages crafted not to comfort the faithful but to confuse them. The courtroom's silence was broken by a faint rustling in the gallery, where a woman in a bright red scarf wiped tears from her eyes. She was a regular at Jakes' Potter's House Church in Dallas, her faith in the bishop now shaken to its core. The juror with braided hair scribbled furiously, her pen moving as if trying to capture the weight of the betrayal. Jennifer Lopez, who had returned to the gallery after the recess, sat stone-faced, her sunglasses now removed, her eyes locked on the screen. Her own history with Diddy, tabloid fodder for years, seemed to pale in comparison to this new revelation. Yet her presence added a layer of intrigue, a silent question of what she knew and when. Rivera continued, her tone softening but no less piercing. We're not criminalizing faith. We're identifying how it was used. These were not words of protection. They were instructions to keep people silent, to shame them into obedience, to discredit truth as weakness. The prosecution's next move was a gut punch. Rivera introduced an affidavit from a former member of Jakes' ministry staff, his identity redacted for safety. The document was read aloud, its words stark and unembellished. From 2017 to 2022, I worked directly under Bishop T.D. Jakes. I was responsible for coordinating off-record conversations, managing appearance scripts, and filtering sensitive communications from influential figures, Diddy included. Diddy's team would regularly contact our office, requesting tailored spiritual language for statements, posts, and closed-door meetings. We were told to provide messaging that emphasized silence, loyalty, and endurance through persecution. The courtroom exhaled collectively, the weight of complicity sinking in. The affidavit continued. I remember one call where Bishop said, "We're not lying. We're just guarding the truth until the world is ready for it." That was after the Miami tapes started circulating internally, after people began asking about the East Wing. The mention of the East Wing sent a murmur through the gallery, a reference to long-rumored private spaces in Diddy's properties where alleged misconduct occurred. The affidavit was a bombshell, not just for its content but for its source. A man who had once been part of Jakes' inner circle, now breaking ranks to expose the truth. Rivera held up another document, this one a direct message submitted anonymously by a verified former Jakes ministry staffer, exchanged with a Diddy associate in October 2022, weeks after the FBI's initial inquiry. The message read, "Bishop says you're covered. He'll remind the faithful who you really are. Sunday's message will do the work." Diddy's response, "Tell him I appreciate the firewall. We good." The word firewall landed like a slap, echoing the memo's language and tying Jakes directly to the strategy. The courtroom silence was deafening, the kind that follows a revelation too heavy to process immediately. Even Grayson, Diddy's attorney, seemed rattled, his pen hovering over his notepad as if searching for a defense that didn't exist. Rivera turned to the jury, her voice low but commanding. This was never just about what Diddy did. It was about how he kept doing it for so long, because someone who was supposed to speak for God was busy scripting for a monster. The judge's gavel struck, adjourning the session, but the room didn't stir. Reporters sat frozen, their deadlines forgotten. Spectators stared at the floor, grappling with the erosion of trust unfolding before them. The woman in the red scarf clutched a small cross necklace, her fingers trembling. The juror with braided hair closed her notebook, her face a mix of anger and sorrow. Lopez slipped out again, this time flanked by security, her expression unreadable but her pace hurried. The prosecution had stripped away the veneer of Diddy's empire, but it was Jakes' involvement that cut deepest. A spiritual leader whose voice had once filled stadiums now stood metaphorically on trial, his words exposed as tools of manipulation. The courtroom felt colder, not in temperature but in spirit, as if the fire of outrage had cooled into a heavy, soul-deep disillusionment. The next session opened under a blanket of somber anticipation. The gallery was fuller now, word of the previous day's revelations spreading like wildfire. Social media was ablaze, with hashtags like Diddy Trial and Jakes Exposed trending globally. X posts from fans and critics alike flooded the platform, some defending Jakes as a victim of circumstance, others condemning him as a hypocrite. Rivera stood with a new folder, thin but ominous, her demeanor as resolute as ever. "Your Honor," she said, "today we present the testimony of a man who never spoke publicly, a man tasked with managing schedules, speeches, and spiritual optics for Bishop T.D. Jakes. His affidavit, signed and verified, tells us how everything worked from the inside." She opened the folder, reading with deliberate clarity. "From 2017 to 2022, I coordinated off-record conversations between Bishop Jakes and high-profile figures, including Sean Combs. I was instructed to craft sermon themes that aligned with Diddy's legal crises, using language of loyalty, silence, and perseverance. Entire weekends were planned around media blow-ups. When someone from the inner circle was about to be exposed, Bishop would be briefed. He'd deliver messages about loyalty under fire or storms sent to distract, always within 72 hours of the headlines. The courtroom stared at the screen as Rivera displayed a chart titled Sermons versus Scandals, Timeline Crossmatch. The left side listed Diddy's scandals. June 2018, assault allegations tied to an NYC party. November 2019, leaked footage of an altercation at Diddy's estate. March 2022, an anonymous whistleblower report to the FBI. The right side listed Jakes' sermon titles, delivered within days of each event. Covering the Called, Brotherhood in the Fire, The Enemy Hates Alignment. The precision was chilling, each sermon a carefully timed response to Diddy's crises. Rivera's voice grew sharper. These were not coincidences. They were coordinated, designed to deflect scrutiny and silence victims with spiritual shame. She paused, her eyes sweeping the jury. This was narrative control, not spiritual guidance, emotional conditioning, not comfort for the faithful. The gallery was a sea of conflicted faces. A man in a suit, likely a Jakes supporter, shook his head, muttering under his breath. A young woman in the back row, clutching a phone, typed furiously, likely live tweeting the proceedings. The juror with braided hair leaned forward, her pen moving again, capturing every word. Rivera continued, her tone softening but no less piercing. Our investigation team matched multiple lines from the leaked call to Jake's publicly available sermons from 2017 to 2022. Phrases like, silence is your strongest sermon, stay aligned, and fear is disobedience were not random. They were coded messages, vague but consistent, designed to justify secrecy and loyalty. She clicked to a slide showing two columns. Column A, the leaked call, column B, sermon excerpts. The parallels were stark. Not everyone deserves the full story from the call matched, speak only what serves the kingdom from a 2019 sermon. Stay aligned, keep the circle tight, aligned with those assigned to your life won't question your silence from a 2021 appearance. The courtroom exhaled in disbelief, the weight of coordination sinking in. Rivera's next exhibit was a voicemail, recorded in late 2022, after the FBI's first wave of inquiries into Diddy's activities. Obtained from a private donor once employed in Jakes' ministry, it was a message from Jakes to an unnamed high-level contact at Combs Enterprises. The judge gave a solemn nod. Admit it. The lights dimmed again, and Jakes' voice filled the room, measured and rehearsed. Sean, I know it feels like the ground is shifting beneath you, but you and we understand that storms don't destroy the chosen. They reveal the jealous. Let them accuse, let them speculate, but don't ever let them forget. Men fall, but the anointed rise. I've already reached out to the right ears in Atlanta. The circle is intact. The recording ended and the silence was crushing. Rivera let it linger, then spoke softly. This wasn't encouragement. This was a crisis plan dressed in scripture, an institution of faith offering not healing but protection for power. The courtroom felt like a cathedral of fallen idols. Diddy didn't react, his hands fidgeting slightly, the only sign of his unraveling composure. Grayson scribbled frantically, his team whispering urgently behind him. The woman in the red scarf was gone, her seat empty, as if she couldn't bear to stay. The juror with braided hair stared at the floor, her notebook closed. Lopez, back in the gallery, sat with her arms crossed, her face a mask of restraint. Rivera turned to the jury, her voice steady but heavy with implication. From the beginning, Sean Combs built rooms of secrecy, hidden parties, silent guests, controlled narratives. But what he never expected was that the voice guiding him from the shadows would be caught on tape. T.D. Jakes wasn't an outsider. He was the bridge between public morality and private corruption. She held up the transcript of the voicemail. This proves it, and it ends the question of whether faith was used as a weapon. It was. And now, those who hid behind it will answer for what they did under it. The judge closed the file, his voice barely above a whisper. This court is adjourned until final arguments begin. But as people rose, they did so slowly, no longer just viewers of a trial, but witnesses to a reckoning. Reporters filed out, their stories already taking shape, promising headlines that would dominate the news cycle. Spectators lingered, some in tears, others in quiet anger, grappling with the betrayal of a man they'd once trusted to speak for God. The prosecution had exposed not just Diddy's crimes, but a system that shielded him. A system where faith was twisted into a tool of control. As the trial moved toward its climax, one question hung over the courtroom, heavy and unresolved. How many still sat in pews, listening to Jakes' voice, unaware that it had once blessed the darkness? The final gavel hadn't fallen, but the echoes of this day would resonate far beyond Miami, shaking the foundations of faith and fame alike. The courtroom reconvened the next morning, but the air was different, thicker, heavier, as if the weight of the previous day's revelations had settled into the walls. The gallery was packed to capacity, with new faces joining the regulars, activists, former congregants of Jake's Potter's house, and even a few celebrities whose names had been tangentially linked to Diddy's orbit. The buzz on X had grown louder overnight, with posts ranging from heartfelt defenses of Jake's to scathing memes accusing him of selling his soul. Rivera stood at the center of the room, her presence commanding despite the fatigue visible in her eyes. She held a single folder, its contents undisclosed but radiating significance. "Your Honor," she began, "today we present our final exhibit, a series of internal documents and communications that confirm the depth of coordination between Sean Combs and Bishop T.D. Jakes. These are not isolated incidents. They are evidence of a spiritual infrastructure built to protect power at the expense of truth." The first document was an email chain, dated September 2022, between Jake's ministry staff and a Combs Enterprises executive. The subject line read, "Alignment Protocols for Media Response." The emails outlined a plan to leverage spiritual messaging during Diddy's upcoming public appearances, with specific instructions to use language of redemption and divine protection to counter negative press. One email from a redacted ministry staffer read, "Bishop has approved the draft. Sermon this Sunday will focus on the anointed under attack. When Sean's team should amplify the message on socials." The courtroom stirred, the implications sinking in. Rivera's voice was calm but relentless. This wasn't a pastor offering comfort. This was a strategist orchestrating a narrative, using the pulpit to shield a man accused of serious crimes. She clicked to another slide, revealing a list titled Emergency Alignment Protocols. Step 1, identify the threat. Step 2, call Jakes. Step 3, shape the narrative. Step 4, remind the faithful of Diddy's purpose. Step 5, silence the noise, elevate the mission. The courtroom gasped, the clinical language exposing the machinery behind the sermons. Rivera's final piece of evidence was a confidential audio file, recorded in late 2022, obtained from a former Jake's ministry employee. It was a voicemail left by Jakes for a high-level contact at Combs Enterprises, and its contents were devastating. The judge nodded and the audio played. "Sean, the world will always try to tear down what God has built. But we know how to hold the line. I've crafted the Sunday language, forgiveness, endurance, the enemy's distractions. You stay off the grid, let them talk. We'll speak louder through the faithful." The recording ended, and the silence was palpable. Rivera stepped forward, her voice soft but unyielding. "This was a system, ladies and gentlemen. A system where faith was not a refuge but a fortress, built to protect the powerful from accountability." She turned to Diddy, who sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the table. Sean Combs didn't just have lawyers and handlers, he had a pulpit. And that pulpit was used to silence victims, to confuse the faithful, to bury the truth. The courtroom sat in stunned silence, the weight of the evidence overwhelming. The judge, his face etched with exhaustion, spoke quietly. "This court recognizes the introduction of these documents as supporting evidence for the obstruction charge. We will reconvene for final arguments tomorrow." The gavel struck, but the sound felt hollow, overshadowed by the collapse of trust in the room. Spectators filed out slowly, some clutching tissues, others whispering in hushed tones. Reporters rushed to file their stories, knowing this was no ordinary trial. It was a cultural earthquake. The woman in the red scarf was back, her eyes red but resolute, as if determined to see the truth through. The juror with braided hair sat back, her notebook open again, her pen moving slowly, deliberately. Lopez was absent, her seat empty, perhaps unable to face another day of revelations tied to her past. As the trial neared its end, the courtroom felt less like a legal arena and more like a stage for a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. Diddy's empire, built on charisma, music, and power, had been laid bare, its foundations cracked by the very voices that once propped it up. But it was T.D. Jakes' fall that hit hardest. A man who had preached redemption now stood exposed as a strategist in a game of silence and control. The prosecution had done more than present evidence. They had peeled back the layers of an institution, revealing how faith could be twisted into a tool of manipulation. The question wasn't just about Diddy's guilt or innocence. It was about the cost of trust, the price of loyalty, and the fragility of the sacred when wielded by the powerful. The final session loomed, but the courtroom already carried the weight of a verdict, not of law, but of morality. The evidence was clear. A spiritual leader had lent his voice to a man accused of heinous acts, crafting sermons to shield him, using scripture to silence victims. The faithful, who had once filled Jakes' pews, now faced a reckoning of their own, forced to question the voice they'd trusted. And Diddy, once untouchable, sat exposed, his empire crumbling under the weight of his own secrets and the complicity of a man who was supposed to represent something greater. As the world awaited the trial's conclusion, one truth was undeniable. What had unfolded in that Miami courtroom wasn't just about crimes. It was about the betrayal of something sacred, the weaponization of faith, and the slow, painful unmasking of those who hid behind it. The story didn't end in the courtroom. Outside, the streets of Miami buzzed with reporters, protesters, and fans, each grappling with the revelations in their own way. Posts continued to pour in, with some calling for Jakes to step down, others defending his legacy, arguing he was merely counseling a friend. But the evidence was hard to dismiss. Audio, memos, affidavits, and voicemails painting a picture of coordination, not coincidence. The trial had become more than a legal battle. It was a mirror held up to society, forcing a reckoning with the intersection of faith, fame, and power. For those who had followed Jakes' sermons, who had danced to Diddy's beats, who had believed in the promise of redemption, the truth was a bitter pill. The voices that had inspired them had also conspired to keep secrets buried. And as the final arguments approached, the world watched, not just for a verdict, but for an answer to the question that lingered in every heart. How do you rebuild trust when the sacred has been used to hide the profane?